afraid of the dark.
Hello, dear listener. The gruesome story I am going to tell today took place during a difficult time for people, when a terrible famine struck the country. What happened will be in my memory for a long time, and give me goosebumps at the mere memory of those events. Please listen to the end and subscribe to the channel. I need your support, thank you. 20 years ago, shortly before his death, my neighbor told me this story. The old man, looking very worn out by life, probably felt his impending end, so he decided to tell me everything. And so one day, still a schoolboy, I was returning home after evening classes. It was already dark outside, and I was slightly surprised to see him sitting calmly near the entrance, as usually at this time, all the old men and women of our building had long taken their places near the TVs. "Hello, Grandpa Ken Goff," I greeted as I approached the door of the house. There was no response, and citing the old man's weak hearing, I repeated, "Hello." "Hello, sorry, I was just lost in thought," he replied. "It's okay, dear Ken Goff. What were you thinking about?" I was in a good mood and decided to engage in conversation. "Oh, just reminiscing about the years when I was still a child." The old man stretched out his trembling hand, indicating the height relative to the asphalt. "Alec, do you have some time? I would like to tell you something." I admit I was slightly surprised. Stories about the past from Grandpa Ken were not rare at all, and quite the opposite, but he had never before asked for permission to start talking, as he believed that a person of his age had a certain status and respect, so listening to his story was an honor for everyone else. But that's not the point. My surprise quickly turned into curiosity. Sitting down next to him, I said I was ready to listen. Know that I have never told anyone this story. Everything you hear now is the undeniable truth. I saw it with my own eyes, and until this moment I have not told anyone. It was in the years after the revolution. It was winter, and since our share of the crop failed, there was a terrible famine. Grandpa Goff frowned and looked reproachfully at me. "You probably don't know what hunger is like. I saw people walking down the street collapsing dead-faced into the snow, and the other passers-by didn't even notice. Everyone behaved as if it were normal. Of course, no one could help but to watch such scenes from my window in the gray, gloomy 5-story building where my father and I lived. It was awful. My father served in the police, so there was always food in our house. I got a little distracted from the main point. My father often disappeared at work. Sometimes he went on urgent business trips, where he would spend days guarding criminals. I was about 10 years old. My excessive curiosity about my father's occupation, as expected, was not satisfied. But one day, after long persuasions and requests, my father finally decided to take me with him on a case. I don't remember what it was about. It seems like an anonymous tip about an old man who allegedly engaged in spreading counter-revolutionary literature. The investigators conducted a search in his apartment. The case seemed routine and posed no threat. Anyway, I managed to persuade my father to take me with him. Grandpa Ken, finishing his sentence, suddenly froze, staring into space. I tried to see what he was looking at, but soon realized that his gaze was directed at nothing. Of course, my father didn't want to, but I still managed to persuade him. The old man continued abruptly. And then exactly at 6 in the morning, he woke me up and told me to get dressed. At that moment, I thought it was probably one of the happiest days of my life. I felt such immense curiosity about this responsible and serious job. And so we got into the arriving car. My father greeted his colleagues. While we were driving to the location, they were passionately discussing something about the upcoming case. I don't remember much, and back then I didn't understand much either. but from what I heard, I concluded that there was going to be a search. Half an hour later, we arrived at the scene. My father told me to stand aside and wait for instructions to enter the apartment where the man lived. The apartment was on the ground floor. I remember standing right at the bottom. My father and his colleagues went up to the landing and knocked on the door. They were not let in for a long time. Someone from his entourage shouted loudly. Soon the door opened, and there stood an elderly man dressed in a worn-out robe, very thin. They showed him some documents. A few officers entered the apartment, and after about 5 minutes, my father appeared and said that I could also go in. This man. His face seemed very strange to me, his gaze. It was so detached, as if he didn't care at all about what was happening around him. He hadn't spoken a word since it all began, and only upon seeing me, something changed in his eyes. It was as if he came to life, but everyone was so engrossed in searching his apartment that no one noticed him staring openly at me. I must admit, it became terribly creepy. They sat him down in the kitchen, chained to the radiator. Someone slapped me on the shoulder saying, "Keep an eye on him, but don't get too close." We were left alone together. I stood by the entrance, trying not to look at him, but I felt his boiling gaze on me. I wanted to leave, but I had to obey my father and, as I thought, his friends. I was ordered to stay here, and so I did. And my head refused to subside. And then, accidentally glancing over, I saw a thin stream of drool stretching from his slightly open mouth to the floor. His eyes were fixed on me, and it seemed that one look from him was enough to plunge me into a state of insane panic. But then the most terrifying thing happened. There was a creak from the next room. As I understood later, my father and his colleagues had opened the door to the basement. So the creak of the door to that very basement came next. Then, after a short silence, I heard my father's excited voice asking where I was right now. And then he started shouting at the top of his lungs for me to leave the kitchen immediately. At first, I didn't understand what he was yelling about and dutifully stayed where I was told. But turning my head towards the corridor, I began to listen, and only then did I clearly hear "Get out of there." Immediately, I looked back at the old man living here and was stunned. An unimaginable grimace depicting complete insanity and wild hatred and anger. His distorted hand reached out towards me. Since he was chained, he couldn't reach me, but there were only a few centimeters left. But the scariest thing was his grin, namely his teeth. Each tooth was sharpened as if he had filed them down with a rasp to achieve such a shape on his face. I even felt the foul breath caused by his efforts to reach me. What I felt at that moment cannot be described in words. My legs began to tremble, and if I had fallen, he could have reached me. It seemed to me that such a monster would only need a second to tear my throat out, but in the next moment, my father burst into the kitchen and shot him in the head. Before he collapsed, his face became as indifferent as it was before he met me. Suddenly, there was a commotion, panic. My father grabbed me, pressing me for a few seconds. Then he joined his comrades, who were arguing about something. Someone covered their face with a cloth. Someone, holding their mouth with their hands, rushed into the entrance, and I still didn't understand what was happening around me. One thing was clear for sure. My father saved me. In the midst of this chaos, I found myself alone with myself again. The sight of blood oozing from under the cloth was not pleasant, and I hurried to leave the kitchen. My heart was still pounding like crazy. I walked out into the corridor and slowly walked along it until I noticed an open door to the basement. Grandpa Ken fell silent, and his wide-open eyes looked so frightened as if he had just relived all that horror again. Slowly, amidst the hustle and bustle around me, I took a few steps, stretching my neck and peered down into the darkness. It took a few seconds for my eyes to adjust, and I realized what was in front of me. There were limbs, different body parts, legs, arms, heads, entrails, bones, and judging by the sizes, they all belonged to children. Children's body parts were piled up, but that was nothing. Nothing compared to the little girl lying in the corner, still alive, but with missing legs, arms with crooked, festering, and bleeding stumps crudely stitched. If you still haven't understood, let me explain. The man who lived in this apartment was a real cannibal. To escape hunger, he kidnapped children to eat them, and he didn't like frozen meat, so he ate them alive. By the way, the girl died shortly after. But how do you know all these details? I asked, still reeling from the shock of what had been recounted. When more people arrived, my father said he would take me home now. I managed to grab a notebook lying on the table in that apartment. I wanted to keep it for myself. Well, it didn't matter. I discreetly grabbed it and tucked it under my clothes. And then, when I finally had the chance to see what it was, it turned out to be the diary of the cannibal, in which he recorded all his methods and techniques of kidnapping children, as well as methods of cooking and storing meat. This notebook is still with me. I can show it to you, by the way. I looked at Grandpa Ken and was startled by surprise. His eyes sparkled like a child's, passionately eager to share some terrible secret, fixed on me, and surprisingly, even to myself, I really wanted to see that notebook. Well, let's go. I'll show you, he said, not waiting for my answer, and began to get up from the bench. Alex, it's time to come home. My mom's voice came from my window. It was my mom calling out, who was already waiting for me after school. Grandpa Ken, I'm sorry, but Mom is calling me. Will you show me this notebook tomorrow? I was burning with curiosity. I regretted that I couldn't see it now. Of course, Alex, of course, come by tomorrow. I ran home. But the next day, I couldn't wait for the long-awaited addition to the story I had heard. I was just burning with curiosity. I walked home from school at a brisk pace, and as I approached my entrance, I slowed down. There were people gathered at the door, and there was also a police car. In the crowd, I saw people with cameras and microphones. Alex, a familiar voice called out, and I saw my mom. Come here. What happened? I asked. Grandpa Ken passed away this morning, my mom replied. But there was something special in her voice. She was extremely excited about something. At that moment, right next to us, a TV presenter from some city program stood up. I heard the following right now. We are next to the house where this morning, in the apartment of the deceased pensioner, numerous human remains and limbs were found. The examination has already established that all body parts belong to children aged 5 to 12. The urban cannibal, that's what they call the deceased on the internet now, although the fact of eating human flesh has not yet been established. A diary was also found in the apartment, in which the pensioner detailed all his actions. Today at 9:30, Ken Goff's body was found. Preliminary estimates suggest that death occurred as a result of a heart attack. The medical examiners who arrived at the scene smelled an odor coming from the basements, where severed limbs and parts of human bodies were found. Also, a diary was found that the suspect was keeping. In it, he detailed how he lured children into his apartment for further abuse, telling the victim an interesting story about a cannibal he supposedly saw in childhood. He offered to go to the apartment to show documentary evidence of what was happening. The interested child agreed and entered the apartment, after which the abuse occurred. And we remind you of the precautions and educational work that needs to be done with your children. I didn't listen further, I just looked at my mom again. She was still looking at me the same way. Alex, I'm the one who discovered the body. I went down to him for salt, knocked, and the door was open. I entered, looked, and he was lying on the floor. His denture was lying nearby, and his mouth was open. I took a closer look, and his teeth were sharp as if he had sharpened them with a file.